Found myself in Metropolis one afternoon, an abandoned city out in the middle of Nevada with nothing around except the ruins of a hotel, a school, a cemetery, and a thin dirt trail. Established in 1910 as an ambitious new farming and railroad hub, the town faced coyotes, disease, and a poor water supply. By 1920, it was bankrupt, and everybody left. Metropolis, just the optimism of that name. I've sought out dozens of places like this across the country, drawn to ghost towns and ruins, the magnetic pull of the white spaces on the map. But what was I looking for? How did I become so addicted to the backroads of America? I'll start at the beginning. I'll start simple. I am an American. I say this to myself, and I marvel at the tangled reaction. There's the flush of embarrassment, the red tingling of some humiliation or slight that I cannot recall. I feel as though I owe somebody an apology. There's the apprehension that comes with knowing I'm sheltered, the sense of being fattened up to be set loose among hunters, the fierce entitlement of an only child. As for the pride and strength that are so often sung about these days, there is some of that. It's a small yet undeniable core that is muffled by the red-faced and jittery feelings, the sense of being foolish, of being misrepresented, of being unprepared. I grew up with this photograph of a man sitting on a bench. He's my grandfather's grandfather. Daddy Reeves, they called him. He was born in 1849 in a Canadian forest. Some say he was adopted. Others say his parents couldn't afford to keep him. As a teenager, he worked as a fur trader for the Hudson Bay Company. He got married and had a daughter and a son. After losing his wife and daughter a few years later, he wandered into Michigan and built a perch fishery on Saginaw Bay. He bought the land for $750, and there he settled, remarrying and starting a new family. Nobody knows about what he left behind in Canada, but everybody knows about that bench. After closing the fishery each night, he'd walk 2 miles to the bar. As the years passed, the walk began to tire him out. In 1908, he talked to the mayor, and the town installed a bench at the halfway point between the fishery and the bar, where he would stop each evening to rest and read the day's paper. This photograph is as close as I can come to explaining why I am an American. In 1941, my grandfather drove across the country from Detroit to California to deliver a car and see the World's Fair in San Francisco. There were no highways, the car broke down constantly, he slept in fields, and he said it was the best trip of his life. He hitchhiked home with a bathing suit salesman, and 3 years later he landed in France in World War II and marched into Germany. Patton was right, my grandfather kept saying. We should have gone after Stalin when we had the chance. After the war, he got married in his uniform and took a job at Sears, where he would work for 38 years. When he retired in 1982, he moved into a house in Caseville, Michigan, where our family's fishery once stood, and he served as township commissioner, where he knew everybody by name. My father followed in his footsteps, except the war was Vietnam, and Sears started offshoring its manufacturing. My dad changed after he lost his job, moving among various retail positions, keeping to himself and hardly speaking at all. And me? I spent a summer working the cash register in the lighting department at Sears. But I've had 28 jobs since I started working at 15, ranging from the night shift at a gas station, to selling Oriental rugs, to teaching graduate school, to running a record label, and now running a design studio. I've never gone to war, and I've never been punched. When I was here at the University of Michigan, I switched majors 5 times, and it took me 6 years to graduate. With some vague notion of writing and wanting to travel, I began studying Japanese literature and translation, which gave way to a vague English program. Then I switched to playwriting and realized I hated the pressure of live performance. So then came film and video studies. And film and video studies was a great way to learn about the world. But when I discovered the film posters of the Russian constructivists, I switched my major to graphic design and stuck with that for a while. Then came graduate school, teaching graduate school, starting community design programs, and then a brief stint in law school, before I began questioning the exclusionary nature of higher education. I am a dilettante, and this troubles me. My life feels insulated, detached from responsibility, and this effect is compounded by the fact that most of my activities are conducted in front of a computer screen. I'm a million miles away from my father and grandfather, men who played by a different set of rules, a belief in country and companies, a dogged faith in firm handshakes and settling down. So I decided to go for a drive. And I kept driving, thinking I might learn a thing or two: New Jersey, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Kansas. Whenever I could find some time in a cheap rental car, I'd pack a bag and drive: Oklahoma, Wyoming, California, Tennessee. Sometimes I'd point the car toward the ocean, other times I'd pick an interesting city along the border: Florida, Texas, Montana, New Mexico. I kept driving, thinking that I might figure out what I'm made of, that I might discover what it means to be a man in America. After 55,000 miles of searching, I wrote a big book about my journey, hoping to find the plot, to craft some sort of narrative for myself. And then I drove another 15,000 miles, talking about my big book to very small audiences. Although I came to understand my schizophrenic country a little better, the dignity of my grandfather seemed even more remote. What kind of man should I be? This question nagged me late at night while I drove along empty back roads, staring into the scrolling asphalt. I'd follow the yellow line and let my mind wander through montages of old movies, advertising jingles, and tattered photographs. Cary Grant lighting a woman's cigarette, Brando and Dean posing in white t-shirts, Eastwood's parched stare, an unsettling amalgamation of Stallone and Schwarzenegger rippling with sweat and unloading a belt-fed weapon. I wanted dignity, grit, muscle, and grace. I waited patiently for enlightenment at scenic viewpoints all over the country: the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Glacier Park, Big Sur. I'd time my arrival for magic hour, the moment when sunset gives everything a movie star glow. And I'd listen to sentimental music along the way, making sure everything was perfect for my big moment: Key West, Death Valley, the Smoky Mountains. I waited, but the flash of insight never came. This is what happens when you watch too much television. Along the way, I absorbed countless billboards, posters, and neon signs. They told me that a real man is attractive, but he does not worry about such things. He is responsible, yet impulsive. A loner, yet social. You'll find him at the end of the bar telling stories and slapping backs while catching the eyes of women, yet he's also simultaneously standing alone near a fence somewhere on a ridge, gazing at Wyoming or Montana. He built that fence himself because he's self-reliant and good with an axe. Now these are the images attached to our khakis, family sedans, and mutual funds. They tell me I don't have sex enough. They tell me to develop six-pack abs and wax my chest. They tell me to wear baseball caps and eat all that I can. They tell me that I am not patriotic enough. I rifled through shoeboxes of old photographs, looking for answers. Here's a black and white snapshot of my grandfather heading off to the war, leaving his new wife behind. Or another where he's standing in the driveway with his two children tugging at his knees. My grandfather's hair is neatly parted, and he has a family, medals from the war, a steady job with a company where he will work for several decades. He has a neat lawn and a sprinkler. He's got a big Buick with fins. He's only 28 years old, yet he's somehow older than I'll ever be. On my car radio, Bo Diddley says his grandfather picked his teeth with a hunting knife and wore the same suit all of his life. I see a distant trailer in the middle of the desert and wonder if that's the place for me, someplace rugged, remote, elemental. I think about the time that I wanted to run away when I was little. My mom said running away was fine as long as I didn't cross the street. In Minneapolis, an old man told me that people lost the plot when they abandoned cities for suburbs. I thought about this while I drove, paying attention to the faded names painted on old brick buildings. Those mint green cursive names, names like Jerry and Sons Hardware Company or Robinson Brothers Manufacturing. Those muscular names that made sense compared to today's childish vocabulary of tweet, Google, blog. It's difficult to feel dignified among our new language. Where does dignity come from? I thought I'd find it at the edge of a mountain or a canyon. Instead, I found it in old hotels and libraries. I found it in the town squares of places like Oxford, Mississippi, or Brady, Texas. Go to any downtown and stand in the ballroom of its oldest hotel and dig those columns and soaring ceilings, all that wood and brass. Go to the Caucus Club in Detroit, a dark velvet steakhouse in the Penobscot building, where the waiter will still tell you stories of Hoffa and Sinatra. You were taking your life in your hands if you gave away one of those tables at lunch, he told me. I had the best steak in years for $10 and wondered why people moved away to eat at Olive Garden. Sometimes there are towns with no name, only a metroplex of today's biggest brands: Target, Mervyn's, Staples, Starbucks, Walmart, Applebee's. And they're always surrounded by a mad ocean of parking spaces, dotted with medians, loops, and traffic calming shrubs. Even though I'm in New Mexico, or maybe Maine, or Idaho, I've never been here before, yet somehow I know where everything is. There's probably a Radio Shack over here right next to a Joann's Fabrics. Everything blurs together in a calculated blend of beige and gray anonymity. Bed Bath & Beyond, Red Lobster, Office Max, Chili's. These shopping centers are everywhere, and nobody really likes them. Nobody will fall in love here. Dignity is not in the design. Words like plaza and village commons and town center are often attached to the signs, but they read like a dark joke. Sometimes there are benches, but nobody sits on them. So why not stack these stores on top of one another and put them in a row? At least you'd have a decent little Main Street town. I often think of the modernists at times like this, of the response of artists and designers to the mechanized horror of World War I. In 1918, Tristan Tzara announced that the beginning of Dada was not the beginning of art, but of disgust. His partner Marcel Janko recalled, "We'd lost confidence in our culture. Everything had to be demolished." We would begin again after the tabula rasa. We began by shocking the bourgeois, demolishing his idea of art, attacking common sense, public opinion, education, institutions, museums, good taste, in short, the whole prevailing order. Or maybe the Russian constructivists, yearning in 1917 for a new technology that would provide a universal trampoline for the great leap into universal human culture. We have this technology today. So I ask, what is today's dangerous art? At a book signing in Pasadena, a tipsy man walked up to me, waving a copy of The Sun Also Rises. "You know what Hemingway understood?" he asked. "Don't talk too much. Keep your feelings to yourself. That's how it was back then. Today, everybody just wants to talk and talk." Now, I just finished reading my book to a small audience, and I answered all kinds of personal questions during the Q&A. Sitting at that folding table with a stack of books and a Sharpie, I felt overexposed. The man slid The Sun Also Rises across the table for emphasis and walked off, mumbling, "Silence, man. That's how it was." My hand went to my pocket. Whenever I encounter a troubling thought or even a flicker of boredom, I pull out my phone. It's become a dumb reflex that borders on the neurochemical, this constant Jones for a hit of fresh data to distract me. But this time I stopped mid-pocket. I thought about the things I do on the internet, the status updates, the likes and tweets, the compulsive monitoring of inboxes and news feeds. All of my chatter boils down to one thing: I'm here, pay attention to me. So I turned off my phone and drove to the next city. And these are my grandfather's sisters being skeptical of a new camera back in the 30s. In the rear view, Nebraska trucks came over the ridge at sunset, and I fantasized about dialing 1-800-USA-TRUCK and hauling freight for 89 cents per mile. My mission would be clear: get from point A to point B. At a gas station in Wyoming, a giant bearded man in spurs was telling the cashier that he just completed his 7-day yoga challenge. I talked to a man in North Dakota who offered to buy me my own drone for $300. A billboard encouraged me to visit America's battleships in person because video games just don't do them justice. A few hours after my final book reading, I stood on an empty street in Salt Lake City, cradling the phone as my father told me that my grandfather was in the hospital. Instead of pointing the car south towards my home in New Orleans, I sped east to Michigan, where my grandfather lay fighting off pneumonia. I did not drive fast enough. I stood in the parking lot of a horrible chain restaurant in South Dakota and wept when I got the news. James A. Reeves Sr. died on September 21st, 2011, at the age of 88. He taught me to fold the American flag into a tight triangle. He taught me how to tie a cleat hitch on a sailboat and how to varnish wood until it looked like warm liquid. For 6 weeks, I drove across the country showing his photograph to strangers in bookstores. My grandfather in uniform, saluting in front of a plane with a pinup girl painted on the fuselage. My grandfather sitting at his big desk at Sears, holding a big black phone, hair neatly parted, black-rimmed glasses, and flashing that grin that always made you feel good, like you and he were part of something. I read the eulogy. I talked about how he inspired me, how he defined a type of faith that now seems lost, for better and worse, a belief in nations, companies, and handshakes. After the funeral in Caseville, We filed out to his little church in the cold rain and watched the American Legion perform a 21-gun salute. A half-circle of World War II veterans saluted the American flag and fired their rifles. They folded the flag into a triangle, marched forward, and presented it to my father. This ritual comforted me. I envied it. Old men that I did not know clasped my shoulder and shook my hand. A grand and honorable man, they said. Driving home under a gray sky, I struggled to connect the dots. Silence, technology, dignified towns, fictional nostalgia, and so much chatter, conferences, talks, I missed my grandfather. I mourned the loss of what he represented, a life of clear steps, service to a nation, a company, then a family. Now, many rejected this narrative, of course, but it nonetheless provided some sort of a plot. Today, the storyline has splintered, which is incredibly exciting because believing in a nation or a corporation is a really strange thing to do. Yet we're left searching for new things to believe in. We've been atomized and polarized, and our technologies sometimes reinforce this, encouraging the short burst or the inward glance. In the middle of the desert, at the far edge of a line of thundering sprawl, I saw a gigantic red blinking sign telling me to like Walgreens on Facebook. I hit the brakes and cut the ignition. Maybe this was the scenic viewpoint I'd been looking for all along. Amid the vast silence of a desert, I was being asked to like Walgreens. I watched the sign blink for a while, then started the engine. So how do you become dignified in America? I still cannot answer the question, but I knew I would return to my new home in New Orleans and do my bit to create better public spaces and better public conversations. And I'd look for ways to embrace silence, to slow down a little. And all those miles and jobs and photographs and careers and town squares finally began to make sense in the rearview mirror. This would be my answer for now. Thank you.